What happened next will shock you. A simple prison visit turned into something that would change everything and save a life in ways no one could have imagined. Like this story, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. The story you're about to listen to begins on what should have been the most normal Tuesday morning at Greystone Correctional Facility. But sometimes the most ordinary moments hide the most extraordinary dangers. The autumn air was crisp that October morning when Aunt Sarah's car pulled into the visitor parking lot of Greystone Correctional Facility. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual as she glanced in the rearview mirror at 5-year-old Emma, who was carefully arranging her small backpack on her lap. The little girl had been asking about this day for weeks, ever since Sarah had finally agreed it was time. "Are you ready to see your daddy, sweetheart?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying a mixture of hope and uncertainty that only adults who have walked through prison doors understand. Emma nodded enthusiastically, her blonde curls bouncing with the movement. I drew him a picture of our new house. Do you think he'll like it?" Sarah's heart clenched. The new house was actually Sarah's modest apartment, where Emma had been living for the past 3 years, while her father, David Kane, served his sentence for embezzlement. 3 years felt like a lifetime to a child who barely remembered what her father's voice sounded like. "I'm sure he'll love it, baby girl," Sarah replied, though she wondered if David would even recognize the daughter he'd left behind when she was barely 2 years old. The walk from the parking lot to the main entrance felt longer than it actually was. Emma's small hand was warm in Sarah's palm, and she could feel the child's excitement radiating through her tiny frame. Other families moved around them, some with the weary expressions of people who had made this journey countless times, others with the nervous energy of first-time visitors. Inside the facility, the fluorescent lights cast everything in harsh, unforgiving shadows. The walls were painted that particular shade of institutional green that seemed designed to drain hope from anyone who looked at it too long. Sarah had visited David twice since his incarceration, but she'd never brought Emma. The child had been too young, too fragile, and frankly, Sarah hadn't been sure David deserved to see his daughter after what he'd put their family through. But Emma had started asking questions. Questions about why Daddy couldn't come to her birthday party, why his voice sounded funny on the phone calls that came every other Sunday, why Aunt Sarah's face got sad whenever Emma mentioned wanting to see him. Sarah realized that keeping them apart wasn't protecting Emma. It was creating a mystery that was perhaps more frightening than the truth. The security checkpoint was thorough but routine. Sarah placed her keys and phone in the plastic tray while Emma watched with wide eyes as the metal detector beeped and guards waved wands over visitors. The child seemed more curious than frightened, which Sarah took as a good sign. "Is this where Daddy lives?" Emma whispered as they moved through the final set of doors. "This is where he stays for now," Sarah corrected gently, "but it's not his real home. His real home is wherever you are." The visitors' hall was larger than Sarah remembered, filled with round tables bolted to the floor and plastic chairs that had seen better decades. The walls were lined with vending machines that looked like they hadn't been restocked since the 90s, and high windows let in thin streams of sunlight that somehow made the room feel even more isolated from the outside world. But what caught Sarah's attention immediately was something new. A small group gathered near the far end of the room. 2 correctional officers stood with what appeared to be a dog handler and a beautiful German shepherd whose alert posture suggested he was working, not just visiting. "Look, Aunt Sarah, there's a doggy!" Emma's face lit up with the pure joy that only children can express when they see an animal. Officer Clara Jensen, a woman in her early 40s with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, turned at the sound of Emma's excited voice. The German shepherd beside her, whose name tag read Rex, lifted his head with professional interest but remained perfectly still. "That's Rex," Officer Jensen said, walking over with a warm smile. "He's here for special visits today. Would you like to say hello?" Emma looked up at Sarah with pleading eyes. Sarah nodded, and the little girl approached Rex with the careful reverence children reserve for animals they desperately want to pet, but have been taught to respect. "Can I touch him?" Emma asked softly. "Rex is working right now, sweetheart, but he likes making friends," Clara explained. "Just let him smell your hand first." Emma extended her small hand, palm up, the way Sarah had taught her to approach unfamiliar dogs. Rex sniffed once, then his tail gave a small, controlled wag. Clara smiled and nodded her approval. "He likes you," Clara said. Rex used to help find dangerous things, but now he helps people feel better during visits. He's very good at his job. As Emma gently stroked Rex's head, Sarah felt some of the tension in her shoulders ease. Maybe this visit would go better than she'd feared. Maybe having a therapy dog around would help Emma feel more comfortable in this intimidating place. The doors at the far end of the hall opened, and inmates began filing in for the morning visit session. Sarah's pulse quickened as she searched the faces, looking for David. She hadn't seen him in person for over 8 months, and she wondered how much he might have changed. Then she saw him. David Kane looked older than his 32 years, his dark hair showing premature gray at the temples, and his face carrying the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from spending years in a place where the lights never fully go out and privacy doesn't exist. He was thinner than she remembered, but not unhealthily so. Prison had given him a lean, careful look that Sarah found unsettling. But when his eyes found Emma, everything about his posture changed. The careful prison mask fell away, replaced by something raw and desperate and loving. He stopped walking so abruptly that the inmate behind him nearly collided with his back. "Emma?" David's voice cracked on his daughter's name. Emma looked up from petting Rex, followed Sarah's gaze, and saw her father for the first time in 3 years. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Emma's face broke into a smile so brilliant it could have powered the facility's lights. "Daddy!" She started running toward him, her small sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. David dropped to his knees, arms outstretched, his face a mixture of joy and disbelief. Other visitors and inmates paused their own reunions to watch this moment. There was something about a child's uninhibited love that could stop conversations and soften even the hardest hearts. But just as Emma reached David, just as she was about to launch herself into his arms, Rex moved. The German Shepherd shot forward like a bolt of lightning, his powerful body inserting itself between Emma and David with a force that seemed to come from nowhere. A low, threatening growl rumbled from his throat as he planted himself firmly in front of Emma, his hackles raised and his body language screaming danger. Emma stumbled backward, confusion replacing joy on her small face. David froze, still on his knees, his arms now hanging uselessly at his sides. The entire visitors' hall went silent, except for Rex's continued growling. "Rex, what?" Clara Jensen was by the dog's side in seconds, her hand on his collar, but Rex refused to budge. His eyes were locked on David with an intensity that made Sarah's skin crawl. "I don't understand," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't doing anything. I was just... Emma's my daughter." But Rex wasn't backing down. If anything, his posture became more aggressive, his growl deepening as he maintained his position between the little girl and her father. Clara had never seen Rex react this way during a therapy visit. He'd been trained for bomb detection before transitioning to emotional support work, and his instincts had saved lives more than once. "Sir, I need you to stand up slowly and step back," Clara instructed David, her professional training kicking in even as her mind raced to understand what was happening. David complied, rising to his feet with his hands visible, the way inmates learn to move when authority figures give commands. But his eyes never left Emma, who had pressed herself against Sarah's legs and was peering around at the dog who had prevented their reunion. "That's not right," Emma said suddenly, her small voice carrying clearly in the silent room. "That's not how Daddy hugs." Sarah felt ice water flood her veins. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Emma looked up at her with the serious expression children get when they're trying to explain something important that adults don't seem to understand. "Daddy's hugs are different. They smell like his soap, and he always lifts me up and spins me. But that man," she pointed at David with the brutal honesty of childhood, "that man was going to hug me wrong." The room remained frozen as everyone processed what the 5-year-old had just said. David's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, hurt, and then something that might have been fear. "Emma, baby, it's me," David said, taking a small step forward. Rex's growl intensified, and the dog moved to block him again. "Don't," Clara said sharply. "Don't move closer." She was studying David's face now, her training in reading body language and detecting deception suddenly at the forefront of her mind. Something was wrong. She couldn't put her finger on what, but Rex's instincts combined with the child's words were setting off every alarm bell she had. "I think we need to pause this visit," Clara announced to the room. Other correctional officers were already moving closer, their hands resting casually but meaningfully on their equipment. "But I haven't done anything wrong," David protested, and there was something in his tone that made Sarah take an instinctive step backward, pulling Emma with her. "No one's saying you have," Clara replied calmly, "but Rex is trying to tell us something, and I've learned to listen when he talks." Rex was indeed trying to communicate something. The dog's nose was working now, his head turning between David and something else, something that seemed to be coming from David's direction, but not David himself. Clara followed the dog's attention to David's visitor's bag, a small canvas satchel that all inmates were allowed to carry personal items in during visits. "I'm going to need to inspect your bag," Clara said. "You already searched it at check-in," David replied, but his voice had changed. The desperate joy of seeing his daughter was gone, replaced by something more careful, more guarded. "Rex seems to think we missed something," Clara said. "Sir, please place the bag on the table and step away from it." David hesitated for just a moment, long enough for Clara to notice, long enough for Rex's growling to shift into something that sounded almost like a warning bark. Then David placed the bag on the nearest table and backed away, his movements stiff and reluctant. Clara opened the bag carefully, removing the few items inside: a legal pad with some notes, a small Bible, a photograph of Emma as a toddler, and what appeared to be David's regular personal effects. Nothing seemed unusual, but Rex was still agitated, still focused on something about David himself. "I need you to empty your pockets," Clara instructed. "I already did that during intake," David said, but he was already complying, pulling items from his prison uniform pockets. A small comb, a few pieces of paper, what looked like part of a granola bar. Rex's nose was working overtime now, and suddenly he sat, the signal he had been trained to give when he detected something significant. But he wasn't sitting next to the items from David's pockets. He was sitting next to David's left foot. "Sir, I need you to remove your shoes," Clara said, her voice taking on the no-nonsense tone that inmates learn not to argue with. David's face went pale. "That's not necessary. I'm not hiding anything." "Then you won't mind showing us," Clara replied. The standoff lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like hours. Emma was pressed against Sarah's side, confused and frightened by the tension she could feel but didn't understand. Other visitors were watching nervously, their own reunions forgotten as they witnessed this drama unfold. Finally, David sat down and began unlacing his shoes. His hands were shaking slightly, and Sarah noticed that he kept glancing toward the exit, as if calculating distances and opportunities. When he pulled off his left shoe, Clara immediately saw what Rex had detected. Built into the sole was a small compartment, expertly hidden but not quite invisible if you knew what to look for. Inside the compartment was a folded piece of paper and something that looked like a small USB drive. "What is this?" Clara asked, carefully extracting the items with gloved hands. "I don't know," David said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Someone must have put that there. I had no idea." Clara unfolded the paper carefully. Written in neat handwriting were Emma's full name, Sarah's address, and the name and location of Emma's preschool. Below that, in different handwriting, were the words, "Package ready for delivery, timeline confirmed." The bottom of the note contained a single line that made Clara's blood run cold. "She's perfect, innocent eyes, will comply easily." Sarah saw Clara's face change as she read the note, saw the professional mask slip just enough to reveal genuine alarm underneath. "What does it say?" Sarah asked, though part of her didn't want to know. Clara looked at Emma, then at Sarah, then back at the note in her hands. "I think we need to get you and Emma somewhere safe right now," she said quietly. "And I think this visit is over." David was on his feet now, his careful prison composure completely gone. "You don't understand," he said, and his voice carried a desperation that was different from the joy of seeing his daughter. This was the desperation of someone whose plans were falling apart. "I had to. They said they'd hurt her if I didn't cooperate." "Who said they'd hurt her?" Clara demanded, but David was already backing away, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for escape routes that didn't exist. Rex remained focused on David, his body language making it clear that he was ready to act if the man made any sudden moves. The dog's training was showing now. This wasn't therapy work anymore. This was protection. "I can't tell you," David said. "You don't know what they're capable of. Emma's not safe. None of us are safe." Sarah felt the world tilting around her. The man she'd brought her niece to see, the man she'd hoped might provide some healing for a little girl who missed her father, was apparently involved in something that threatened Emma's safety. The note in Clara's hands suggested something too horrible to fully process. "Aunt Sarah, why is everyone scared?" Emma asked, her small voice cutting through the adult tension like a knife. Sarah knelt down to Emma's level, forcing herself to speak calmly, even as her heart raced. "We're not scared, baby girl, but I think we need to go home now." "But I wanted to show Daddy my picture," Emma said, pulling the drawing from her backpack, a crayon illustration of stick figures labeled Me, Aunt Sarah, and Daddy, standing in front of a house with a big yellow sun overhead. The innocence of the drawing in, contrast to the sinister note in Clara's hands, created a moment of cognitive dissonance so sharp it was almost physical. Here was a child's pure love rendered in crayon, while adults around her navigated dangers she couldn't begin to understand. "You can show him another time," Sarah said, though she was beginning to doubt there would ever be another time. Clara was already radioing for backup, speaking in the coded language that correctional facilities use to communicate emergencies without alarming visitors. David was being surrounded by officers now, his cooperation no longer voluntary. But as they led him away, David turned back toward Emma one more time. "I'm sorry, baby girl," he called out, his voice breaking. "Daddy tried to protect you. I tried to keep you safe." Emma waved at him, still not understanding why everyone looked so serious, still believing in the fundamental goodness of the world the way only children can. Rex remained at Clara's side, his alert posture gradually relaxing as David was removed from the room, but his eyes stayed fixed on the exit where David had disappeared, as if he understood that the danger wasn't over, it was just leaving for now. Clara looked down at the USB drive in her evidence bag, wondering what horrors it might contain. She had a sinking feeling that this interrupted visit was just the beginning of something much larger and much more dangerous. "Officer Jensen," Sarah said quietly, "what happens now?" Clara met her eyes, and Sarah saw her own fears reflected there. "Now we find out who David was really working with," Clara replied, "and we make sure they never get anywhere near Emma." But even as she said it, Clara knew that the note's reference to Emma being perfect and ready for delivery suggested that whoever was behind this had been planning for a long time. The USB drive in her hands might contain evidence of a network much larger than one desperate father trying to see his daughter. Rex pressed against Clara's leg, a gesture that in their partnership meant he sensed ongoing danger. The dog's instincts had stopped something terrible from happening today, but Clara had the disturbing feeling that they had only prevented the first move in a much larger and more sinister game. As Sarah led Emma toward the exit, the little girl looked back over her shoulder one more time. "Aunt Sarah, why didn't the doggy like Daddy?" Sarah didn't have an answer that would make sense to a 5-year-old. How do you explain to a child that sometimes the people who are supposed to love and protect you can become the very source of danger? How do you tell someone that innocent that the world contains predators who see children not as precious individuals, but as commodities to be traded? "Sometimes dogs know things that people don't," Sarah finally said, which was perhaps the most honest answer she could give. As they walked back through the security checkpoints and metal detectors, Sarah realized that their lives had just changed forever. The visit that was supposed to give Emma closure and perhaps healing had instead revealed a threat so serious that she didn't even know how to begin processing it. Behind them, Clara was already on the phone with law enforcement agencies beyond the prison walls, beginning the process of unraveling whatever network David had become entangled with. The USB drive would be analyzed, the note would be traced, and investigators would start the careful work of following threads that might lead to other children in danger. But for now, Sarah's only goal was getting Emma safely away from this place and back to the simple world of coloring books and children's television shows and bedtime stories where monsters only existed in fairy tales and always got defeated in the end. Rex watched them go, his training telling him that his work here was done for now. But somewhere in the dog's keen intelligence, he understood that this case was far from over. The scent signatures he had detected, the behavioral cues that had triggered his protective instincts, were all stored in his remarkable memory for future reference. If the people who had tried to use David ever came near Emma again, Rex would be ready. The forensics lab at the county sheriff's department had seen plenty of disturbing evidence over the years, but Detective Maria Santos felt her stomach turn as the contents of David's USB drive filled her computer screen. 3 hours had passed since Clara Jensen had called in the prison incident, and what they'd discovered made the threatening note look like child's play. The drive contained over 200 photographs, all taken with a telephoto lens from various distances. Emma at her preschool playground, laughing as she went down the slide. Emma walking hand in hand with Sarah to the grocery store. Emma in the park, feeding ducks with the innocent joy that only children possess. The photos were organized by date, creating a timeline that stretched back nearly 6 months. But it was the files labeled Project Innocence that made Maria's hands shake as she scrolled through them. Detailed profiles of 12 different children, complete with daily schedules, favorite activities, family structures, and what the files coldly referred to as acquisition difficulty ratings. Emma's file was marked Priority Target, Phase 2 Implementation. Jesus Christ, breathed Detective Tom Bradley, Maria's partner, as he looked over her shoulder. This isn't just about David's kid. This is organized. Maria clicked on a video file labeled Training Module 3. The screen filled with footage of what appeared to be a warehouse, where several children sat in a circle while an adult read them a story. At first glance, it looked innocent, until Maria noticed the restraints on some of the children's ankles and the way their eyes seemed hollow, distant. "Turn it off," Tom said quietly. "We've seen enough to know what we're dealing with." But Maria was already opening another file, this one labeled Client Preferences, October Delivery Schedule. The document contained a list of names, ages, and what appeared to be specific requests from buyers. Emma's name was at the top of the list, with a notation that made Maria feel physically sick. Blonde, compliant, trained for household integration, premium price confirmed. Clara Jensen arrived at the sheriff's department just as Maria was printing out the files for the task force that was already being assembled. The correctional officer looked like she hadn't slept, which wasn't surprising given that she'd spent the morning trying to make sense of how a routine therapy dog visit had uncovered what appeared to be a human trafficking operation. "How bad is it?" Clara asked without preamble. Maria handed her a summary sheet she'd prepared. "Bad enough that we've got FBI agents flying in from 3 different states. The operation spans multiple jurisdictions, and based on these files, they've been active for at least 2 years. Clara read the summary, her face growing paler with each line. "And David?" "He's talking now," Tom said. "Turns out he wasn't lying about being coerced. They approached him 8 months ago with photos of Emma at school and told him he could either cooperate or watch his daughter disappear. They promised him early parole if he helped with the handoff." "What handoff?" Clara asked, though she suspected she didn't want to know the answer. "Today's visit wasn't just a reunion," Maria explained. "David was supposed to give Emma a small toy during their hug, something with a tracking device. The plan was for someone to grab her from Sarah's apartment building tonight, while Sarah was at work." Clara sank into a chair, the weight of what had almost happened hitting her fully. If Rex hadn't intervened, that little girl would be gone by morning, Tom finished grimly. And based on these files, she wouldn't be the first. The door to the conference room opened, and Agent Patricia Wells from the FBI's Crimes Against Children unit entered, with a stack of folders under her arm. She was a small woman with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen too much, but her voice carried absolute authority when she spoke. "I've been reviewing the materials you sent over," Agent Wells said without introduction. "This case is connected to at least 4 missing children cases across 3 states. We're looking at a network that's been operating with military precision." She spread photos across the conference table, school pictures of children ranging in age from 4 to 8, all with the same blonde hair and blue eyes as Emma. All had been reported missing within the past 18 months, all from single-parent or guardian households, all in situations where their disappearance could be initially attributed to custody disputes or runaways. "The pattern is sophisticated," Agent Wells continued. "They target children in vulnerable family situations, gather intelligence for months, then use leverage against family members to facilitate the abduction. David's situation is textbook: incarcerated parent, financial stress on the guardian, child with limited social support network." Clara studied the photographs, noting the similarities between all the children and Emma. How did they know about David's situation? "That's where it gets interesting," Agent Wells replied, pulling out another file. "The intelligence gathering appears to be happening inside the prison system itself. Someone with access to inmate records has been identifying potential targets and their families." Tom looked up from the files he'd been reviewing. "You're saying there's someone inside Greystone?" We're certain of it, Agent Wells confirmed. The level of detail in these files about David's psychological profile, his relationship with his daughter, even his scheduled visits, that information came from inside the system. Maria's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it and felt ice water fill her veins. "We've got a problem," she said, showing the screen to the others. "That's from the team watching Sarah's apartment. A van's been circling the building for the past hour. License plate comes back to a shell company." Agent Wells was already reaching for her radio. "All units, this is Wells. We need immediate response to the apartment complex. Suspects may be attempting acquisition despite the failed handoff." Clara stood up abruptly. "I'm coming with you." "This isn't correctional facility business anymore," Agent Wells said. "This is federal." "Rex detected something the rest of us missed," Clara replied firmly. "If there are more people involved in this network, he might be able to identify them. That dog has instincts that have saved more lives than I can count." Agent Wells considered this for a moment, then nodded. "Bring him, but stay back until we've secured the scene." The drive to Sarah's apartment complex took 12 minutes that felt like hours. Maria's radio crackled with updates from the surveillance team. The van had stopped circling and was now parked across the street, its occupants apparently waiting for something. Sarah's building was a modest 3-story structure in a working-class neighborhood where people minded their own business and asked few questions. Exactly the kind of place where a child could disappear without too many witnesses. The van was a dark blue Ford with tinted windows, positioned with a clear view of the building's main entrance. "2 occupants in the vehicle," came the voice over the radio, both male, late 20s to early 30s. "They're using binoculars to watch the building." Agent Wells coordinated the response from her vehicle, positioned 3 blocks away. "Unit 2, can you get a visual on the apartment windows?" "Affirmative. Lights are on, curtains closed. We can see movement inside." Clara sat in the passenger seat of Maria's unmarked car, Rex alert and focused in the back seat. The dog seemed to sense the tension, his ears up and his attention fixed on the apartment building. "There," Clara said suddenly, pointing to a figure that had emerged from the apartment building's side entrance. "That's Sarah." Sarah was carrying Emma, who appeared to be sleeping against her shoulder. They moved quickly toward a car parked in the building's small lot, Sarah's movements suggesting someone who was trying to be careful without looking like she was fleeing. "Smart woman," Tom commented from the driver's seat. "She's getting the kid out of there." But as Sarah reached her car, the van's doors opened. 2 men got out, moving with purpose toward the parking lot. They weren't running, but their body language suggested people who were used to taking what they wanted without asking permission. "All units, move now," Agent Wells commanded over the radio. What happened next unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance of law enforcement response. Police vehicles converged on the parking lot from 3 directions, while federal agents approached on foot from positions they'd taken around the building's perimeter. The 2 men from the van froze when they realized they were surrounded, but instead of surrendering, they made a decision that turned the situation dangerous. The taller of the 2 men pulled something from his jacket, not a weapon, but what appeared to be a small device with an antenna. "He's got a radio," Agent Wells shouted. "They're calling for backup." Rex was barking now, a sound Clara had rarely heard from him during his therapy work. But this wasn't therapy barking. This was the sound of a working dog who'd detected immediate danger. "There are more of them," Clara said, her training in reading Rex's signals kicking in. "He's telling us there are more of them nearby." As if to confirm her words, a second van appeared at the far end of the street, moving fast toward the scene. But instead of stopping to help their associates, it turned down a side street and disappeared. "Unit 5, pursue that second vehicle," Agent Wells commanded. "All other units, secure the suspects and the family." The 2 men from the first van were on the ground now, hands zip-tied behind their backs, while Sarah clutched Emma protectively against her chest. The little girl was awake now, confused and frightened by the chaos around her. Clara approached with Rex on a short leash, the dog's attention focused intently on the 2 suspects. As they got closer, Rex's posture changed. His hackles rose and he emitted the same low growl he'd used at the prison. "He recognizes something about them," Clara told Agent Wells. "Maybe their scent, maybe their behavior patterns, but these men have been near Emma before." Agent Wells knelt down beside the suspects, her voice taking on the no-nonsense tone that federal agents use when they want information quickly. "You gentlemen have some explaining to do. We know about Project Innocence, we know about the client list, and we know you were here to collect a specific child." The taller suspect, a man with prison tattoos covering his forearms, remained silent. But his partner, younger and clearly less experienced in dealing with law enforcement, glanced nervously between Agent Wells and the federal agents surrounding them. "I want a lawyer," the younger man said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You'll get a lawyer," Agent Wells replied, "but right now, there are other children in danger. Help us find them, and we'll make sure the prosecutor hears about your cooperation." Rex was still focused on the suspects, but now he was also sniffing around their van. Clara watched as the dog moved methodically around the vehicle, his nose working overtime to process scents that humans couldn't detect. Suddenly, Rex sat, the signal that he had found something significant. He was positioned next to the van's rear wheel well, his body rigid with attention. Agent Wells called over to one of the crime scene technicians. "We need this vehicle processed immediately. The dog's indicating something important." As the technician began examining the area where Rex had alerted, Clara's radio crackled with an update from the team that had pursued the second van. "Unit 5 to command. We've lost the second vehicle, but we found something interesting. There's an abandoned warehouse about 2 miles from here with fresh tire tracks and evidence of recent activity." "What kind of evidence?" Agent Wells asked. "Children's toys, food containers, and what looks like temporary sleeping arrangements for multiple kids. This place was being used for something, and recently..." Clara felt her stomach drop. The warehouse was probably where the children were held before being transported to their final destinations. If the operation was as sophisticated as the files suggested, there might be children there right now. Agent Wells was already coordinating a response to the warehouse while maintaining the scene at the apartment complex. "Unit 6, take a team to that warehouse immediately. Full tactical response. We don't know how many suspects or potential victims we're dealing with." Sarah finally approached Clara, Emma still in her arms. The little girl's eyes were wide with confusion and fear, but when she saw Rex, some of the tension left her small face. "That's the doggy from the prison," Emma said softly, "the one who didn't like the wrong daddy." Clara's heart clenched at the phrase wrong daddy. Children had an instinct for detecting when adults were pretending to be something they weren't, and Emma had sensed something false about David even before Rex's intervention. "That's right, sweetheart," Clara said gently. "Rex is very good at knowing when something isn't right. He helped keep you safe today." Sarah looked at Clara with gratitude and exhaustion in equal measure. "What happens now? Are we safe?" "You're safe for now," Clara replied honestly, "but this is bigger than just what happened today. We're going to need you and Emma to stay somewhere secure while we figure out how extensive this network is." Agent Wells approached, having finished coordinating the warehouse response. "Mrs. Martinez, we're going to need to ask you and Emma some questions, but not tonight. Right now, we're arranging for you to stay at a safe location while we process this scene and search the warehouse." "How long will that take?" Sarah asked. "As long as it takes to make sure all the people involved in this operation are behind bars," Agent Wells replied. "Based on what we've found so far, this network has been operating for years. We need to be thorough." The crime scene technician working on the van called Agent Wells over. "You need to see this," he said, holding up a small plastic bag containing what appeared to be a child's hair clip. "There are 12 different hair samples on this clip," the technician explained, "all different colors, all consistent with children between the ages of 4 and 8. This vehicle has been used to transport multiple children." Clara felt sick. 12 different children meant 12 families destroyed, 12 lives stolen. And those were just the ones whose DNA had ended up on a single hair clip. Rex was still alert, his attention now focused on something in the distance. Clara followed his gaze and saw a figure watching them from the roof of a building across the street. The figure disappeared as soon as Clara spotted it, but Rex's continued focus suggested that someone was still observing the scene. "Agent Wells," Clara said quietly, "we're being watched." Agent Wells followed Clara's gaze to the rooftop, then immediately radioed for additional units to search the surrounding buildings. "This operation is more sophisticated than we initially thought," she told Clara. "They've got spotters, backup plans, and probably escape routes we haven't even considered." The radio crackled with an update from the warehouse team. "Command, this is Unit 6. We've secured the warehouse and found evidence of recent occupation by multiple children. No kids here now, but we've got sleeping bags, food containers, and what appears to be a classroom setup." "A classroom setup?" Agent Wells asked. "Affirmative. Desks, books, educational materials. It looks like they were keeping children here for extended periods and providing some kind of instruction. Clara shuddered at the implications. The operation wasn't just about abducting children. It was about conditioning them, preparing them for whatever their ultimate fate was supposed to be. Emma had fallen asleep again in Sarah's arms, exhausted by the day's events. Looking at the peaceful expression on the child's face, Clara was struck by how close they'd come to losing her, to monsters who saw her not as a precious individual, but as a commodity to be traded. "Officer Jensen," Agent Wells said, "I want to thank you and Rex for what you did today. Without your intervention, we never would have uncovered this network." Clara looked down at Rex, who was now lying calmly at her feet, his alert work finished for the moment. "He's the hero here. I just listened when he tried to tell me something was wrong." As the scene wound down and Sarah and Emma were transported to a secure location, Clara reflected on how a routine therapy visit had turned into something that would probably make national news. The investigation would continue for months, unraveling connections between the prison system, the trafficking network, and whoever was coordinating the entire operation. But for now, one little girl was safe, and that felt like enough. What would you do if your own instincts told you something was wrong, but everyone around you said everything was fine? Sometimes the most important voice is the one that speaks without words. The Digital Forensics Lab at FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. hummed with activity at 2 a.m. Agent Patricia Wells had called in every favor she had to get the files from David's USB drive analyzed by the Bureau's best cybercrime specialists. What they discovered made her previous cases involving online predators look like amateur hour. Dr. Jennifer Chen, the FBI's leading expert in dark web investigations, looked up from her computer screen with the exhausted expression of someone who had been staring at horrors for too long. "This is the most sophisticated operation I've seen in 15 years of doing this work," she said, her voice hoarse from hours of explaining technical details to agents who understood criminals better than code. The USB drive hadn't just contained photos and profiles. It was a window into an entire underground marketplace that operated with the efficiency of a legitimate business. The files revealed client databases, pricing structures, delivery schedules, and what the organization coldly referred to as quality control measures. "They've got a rating system," Dr. Chen continued, clicking through screens that Agent Wells wished she could unsee. "Children are categorized by age, appearance, compliance level, and what they call training responsiveness. Emma scored highest in every category." Agent Wells studied the data on her screen, noting the clinical language used to describe what amounted to the systematic abuse of children. "What about the client list? Are we looking at buyers or something more organized?" The implications hit Agent Wells like a physical blow. They weren't just dealing with individual predators. This was an organized system that supplied children to institutions designed specifically for their exploitation. Agent Wells's phone buzzed with an encrypted message from the field team at the warehouse. The message contained a single photo that made her stomach turn. A wall covered with children's drawings, all depicting the same brick building with barred windows and adults in uniforms. "Dr. Chen, I need you to cross-reference these files with missing children reports from the past 3 years," Agent Wells said, forwarding the photo. "And I need you to look for any references to institutional facilities or training centers." As Dr. Chen worked, Agent Wells called Detective Maria Santos, who was coordinating the investigation from the local level. "Santos, we've got a bigger problem than we thought. This isn't just about trafficking. They're running some kind of institutional operation." "What kind of institution?" Santos asked, though her tone suggested she suspected the answer wouldn't be one anyone wanted to hear. "The kind that takes children and conditions them for long-term exploitation," Agent Wells replied. "How's the interrogation going with the suspects from the van?" "The younger one is starting to crack," Santos said. "He's scared of someone called the Director. Says this person runs everything from inside some kind of facility that nobody talks about. Claims he's only ever seen the Director once, and it was enough to keep him loyal through fear alone." Agent Wells felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to form in her mind. An operation this sophisticated required more than just street-level criminals. It needed someone with institutional knowledge, access to resources, and the ability to operate without attracting attention from law enforcement. "Santos, I need you to ask him specifically about inside help," Agent Wells said. "Someone with access to prison records, social services files, maybe even law enforcement databases. This level of intelligence gathering doesn't happen without someone on the inside. Back at the warehouse, Clara Jensen was working with Rex to process scents that might help identify other locations used by the trafficking network. The dog's extraordinary olfactory abilities had already helped them understand that the warehouse had housed at least 15 different children over the past 6 months. Rex moved methodically through the space, his nose cataloging information that would be impossible for humans to detect. Near what appeared to be a sleeping area, he stopped and sat, indicating that he had found something significant. Clara called over the crime scene technicians, who carefully excavated the area where Rex had alerted. Buried under a loose floorboard, they found a small notebook written in a child's handwriting. The entries were heartbreaking in their innocence and terrifying in their implications. Day 12. They said Mommy will come get me soon if I'm good. Day 18. The nice teacher says I'm learning fast. I miss my cat. Day 25. Tommy tried to run away. They brought him back different. Day 30. I don't think Mommy is coming. Clara felt tears threatening as she read the entries. The handwriting belonged to a child young enough to still form letters carefully, someone who was trying to make sense of a situation no child should ever experience. There are more notebooks, one of the technicians called from across the room, at least a dozen of them, all hidden in different locations. Each notebook told a similar story. Children brought to the warehouse, told they were in a temporary situation while their families sorted out problems, gradually conditioned to accept their circumstances as normal. The notebooks revealed a systematic process of psychological manipulation designed to break down a child's resistance and create compliance. But it was the final entry in one notebook that made Clara's blood run cold. Day 45. The director came today, said I'm ready for my new family. I hope they have a dog. Rex was growing more agitated as they processed the scene, his training telling him that the scents he was detecting belonged to children who were in active danger. The dog's behavioral changes suggested that some of the children who had been held at the warehouse were still alive and still in the trafficking network. Clara's radio crackled with a message from Agent Wells. Jensen, we need Rex at a second location. The suspects are starting to talk, and they've given us an address. The address led them to what appeared to be an abandoned school on the outskirts of the city. The building had been closed for budget reasons 3 years earlier, but recent utility records showed someone had been paying to keep the electricity and water running. As their convoy approached the school, Rex's behavior became increasingly alert. The dog was focused on the building with an intensity that Clara had never seen during their partnership. Something about this place was setting off every instinct he had. Multiple vehicles in the parking lot, came the voice over the radio from the advance team. Lights on in several classrooms. This location is definitely active. Agent Wells coordinated the approach, mindful that if children were inside the building, a tactical response might traumatize them further. Perimeter teams, watch for any attempts to move children out of the building. Anyone who tries to leave gets stopped and detained. Clara and Rex were positioned with the command vehicle, waiting for the all-clear to enter the building. But Rex was becoming increasingly agitated, whining and pacing in a way that suggested immediate danger to children. He's telling us there are kids in there right now, Clara told Agent Wells, and they're scared. Agent Wells made the decision to accelerate the timeline. All teams, we're going in now. Children are potentially in immediate danger. The entry into the school revealed a nightmare that would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their careers. The building had been converted into a facility designed to systematically process children for trafficking. Classrooms had been turned into dormitories. The gymnasium had been divided into individual cells. And what used to be the principal's office was now a command center with computers and communication equipment. But it was the basement that revealed the true horror of the operation. Rex led them directly to a reinforced door that opened onto a series of rooms designed for what could only be described as training purposes. The rooms contained cameras, recording equipment, and furnishings that made the intent clear. This was where children were conditioned for exploitation. "We've got 12 children," came the voice over the radio from the team clearing the dormitory areas. "Ages range from about 4 to 9. They're alive, but they're going to need immediate medical and psychological attention." Clara followed Rex through the facility, the dog's nose leading them to evidence that would help prosecutors understand the full scope of what had been happening here. In what used to be the teacher's lounge, Rex alerted to a filing cabinet that contained detailed records on every child who had passed through the facility. The records were chilling in their thoroughness. Each child had a complete file, including psychological assessments, training progress reports, and what the facility staff referred to as placement recommendations. The files revealed that children were being systematically broken down and rebuilt according to the preferences of their eventual buyers. Emma's file was among them, labeled Priority Acquisition, Advanced Placement Track. The file contained photos taken from a distance, detailed observations of her personality and behavior patterns, and a training plan that made Clara feel physically sick to read. But it was the signature at the bottom of Emma's file that made Clara's blood freeze. The handwriting was familiar. She'd seen it every day for the past 5 years on shift reports and incident documentation at Greystone Correctional Facility. The signature belonged to Warden Robert Hayes. Clara stared at the document, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The man who ran the prison where she worked, the man who had implemented the therapy dog program that had saved Emma's life, was apparently the same person orchestrating the trafficking network that had targeted her. "Agent Wells," Clara called, her voice barely steady. "You need to see this." Agent Wells took the file and read the signature, her expression growing grim. "How well do you know this Warden Hayes?" "He's been at Greystone for 8 years, Clara replied. "He implemented most of the rehabilitation programs, including the therapy dog visits. Everyone respects him. He's scheduled to receive a state award for prison reform next month." The irony was devastating. The man being honored for his humanitarian approach to corrections was simultaneously running an operation that destroyed children's lives. It explained how the network had access to detailed information about inmates and their families, how they knew which prisoners could be leveraged and which families were vulnerable. "He used his position to identify targets," Agent Wells said, the pieces falling into place. "Inmates with children, families under financial stress, custody situations that could provide cover for disappearances. He had access to all the information they needed." Rex was still working the scene, his nose leading them to more evidence of the systematic horror that had been operating under the cover of legitimate institutional authority. In the school's old library, they found a sophisticated computer setup that had been used to coordinate with buyers around the world. The computers contained client communications that revealed the global scope of the operation. Children weren't just being trafficked locally, they were being shipped to buyers in multiple countries, with the school serving as a processing center where they could be prepared for their specific destinations. "We've got communications with facilities in 6 different countries," Dr. Chen reported over the radio from her remote analysis station. "This isn't just a local trafficking ring, it's an international network with this school as one of several processing centers." As crime scene technicians processed the evidence, Clara tried to reconcile the man she thought she knew with the monster revealed by the documentation. Warden Hayes had always seemed genuinely committed to rehabilitation and prisoner welfare. He'd approved the therapy dog program specifically because he believed in helping inmates maintain connections with their families. But now, she understood that his interest in family connections had a darker purpose. Every therapy visit, every family interaction he'd observed, had been potential intelligence gathering for his trafficking operation. He'd used his position of trust to identify and target the most vulnerable families in the system. The children rescued from the school were transported to a specialized medical facility equipped to handle trafficking victims. Clara watched as they were loaded into ambulances, each small face carrying trauma that would take years to process and heal. Rex seemed to understand that his work was done for now. The dog's posture relaxed as the last child was safely removed from the building, but Clara could tell that the scenes and scents he'd processed today would stay with him. Therapy dogs were trained to help people heal from trauma, but Rex had been forced to witness trauma being deliberately inflicted. "Agent Wells, what happens now?" Clara asked as they prepared to leave the school. "Now we arrest a prison warden and start unraveling an international network," Agent Wells replied. "And we figure out how many other institutions have been compromised by people like Hayes." The drive back to Greystone Correctional Facility felt surreal. Clara was returning to a workplace where she'd felt safe and purposeful, but now she knew it had been compromised by someone who'd used his authority to facilitate the worst kind of crimes against children. Warden Hayes was in his office when they arrived, reviewing paperwork with the calm efficiency that had always characterized his management style. He looked up with genuine surprise when Agent Wells and a team of federal agents entered with arrest warrants. "There must be some mistake," Hayes said, his voice carrying the confusion of someone who believed his cover was still intact. "What's this about?" Agent Wells placed the file with Emma's information on his desk, open to the page with his signature. It's about Project Innocence, Warden Hayes. It's about the children you've been trafficking through a network that uses this prison as an intelligence-gathering center. For just a moment, Hayes's careful mask slipped, and Clara saw something cold and calculating in his eyes. Then the mask returned, and he was once again the concerned administrator who couldn't understand what these agents were talking about. "I don't know what you think you've found," Hayes said carefully, "but I can assure you that I have never been involved in anything illegal, let alone anything involving children." But Rex was in the room now, and the dog's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. The same low growl that had saved Emma's life at the prison visit. The same aggressive posture that had identified the men at the apartment complex. Rex recognized Hayes as someone connected to the network that had threatened children. Clara watched Hayes' face as he realized that a dog's instincts had exposed him in a way that all his careful planning and institutional authority couldn't protect against. For the first time since they had entered his office, Hayes looked genuinely afraid. "Robert Hayes, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit human trafficking, child endangerment, and operating a criminal enterprise," Agent Wells said, signaling for the other agents to restrain him. As they led Hayes away in handcuffs, Clara felt a mixture of relief and betrayal. The man who had given her the opportunity to do meaningful work with Rex had simultaneously been using that same work environment to facilitate crimes against children. But there was also a sense of justice in the way it had ended. Hayes had been brought down by the very therapy dog program he'd created as cover for his operations. Rex's instincts and training had not only saved Emma, but had exposed an entire network that might have continued operating for years. "Officer Jensen," Agent Wells said as they watched Hayes being loaded into a federal transport vehicle, "I want you to know that without you and Rex, none of this would have been possible. You trusted your dog's instincts when it would have been easier to ignore them." Clara looked down at Rex, who was now calm and focused, ready for whatever came next. "He's the real hero here. I just listened." As news of the arrests began to spread, Clara realized that her work was far from over. The therapy dog program would need to be rebuilt under new leadership, the prison security protocols would need to be completely overhauled, and Rex would probably be needed to help identify other locations and people connected to the network. But for now, she was content knowing that Emma was safe, that 12 other children had been rescued, and that a man who had used his position of trust to facilitate unspeakable crimes was finally facing justice. The investigation would continue for months as authorities worked to identify all the victims and trace the international connections revealed by the school's computers. But Clara knew that the most important victory had already been won. A little girl who should have been stolen from her family was instead sleeping safely in her aunt's arms. If someone you trusted completely turned out to be living a double life, how would you know? What signs might you have missed that seemed normal at the time? 3 days after Warden Hayes' arrest, Clara Jensen found herself sitting in an unmarked van outside Sunshine Daycare Center, watching 5-year-old Emma play on the swing set through Rex's trained eyes. The little girl laughed as she pumped her legs, trying to swing higher than the boy next to her, completely unaware that federal agents were positioned around the playground's perimeter. Agent Wells had insisted on the protection detail after discovering that Hayes' network extended far beyond what they'd initially uncovered. The arrest of the warden had triggered a series of emergency communications between cells operating in multiple states, and intercepted messages suggested that Emma remained a high-priority target. "She looks so normal," Detective Santos observed from the passenger seat, her voice carrying the wonder of someone who couldn't reconcile the child's innocent joy with the horrors they'd discovered in her case file. Clara adjusted her binoculars to keep Emma in sight. That's what makes this so evil. To them, her normalness, her trust, her innocence, that's exactly what made her valuable. Rex lay alert but calm in the back of the van, his training telling him that they were in protection mode rather than search mode, but his ears were constantly moving, processing sounds that might indicate approaching danger. The dog had become hyper-vigilant since the warehouse raid, as if he understood that the network they'd disrupted was still active and dangerous. Clara's radio crackled with an update from Agent Wells. "Jensen, we've got movement at the Riverside Elementary location. Rex's nose might be needed to confirm what we're seeing." The elementary school was 15 minutes away, in a neighborhood that looked exactly like the kind of place where families moved to give their children safe, normal childhoods. But as they approached the building, Clara could see why Agent Wells had called for Rex's expertise. A maintenance van was parked behind the school, its back doors open, while two men in work uniforms carried what appeared to be cleaning supplies into the building. The scene looked completely normal, except that it was Saturday, and according to the school's custodial schedule, no maintenance work was scheduled for the weekend. "Rex is telling me something's wrong," Clara said as they parked a block away. The dog was already showing signs of alertness that suggested he was detecting scents associated with the trafficking network. "Those aren't real maintenance workers." Agent Wells positioned her team around the school while Clara and Rex approached from the rear. The dog's behavior became increasingly focused as they got closer to the building, his nose working to process familiar scents that shouldn't be present at an elementary school. Rex led them directly to the maintenance van, where he immediately sat, the signal that he'd detected something significant. Agent Wells called for a crime scene technician to examine the vehicle while her team prepared to enter the school. Inside the van, hidden beneath legitimate cleaning supplies, they found equipment that had nothing to do with maintenance: zip ties, chloroform-soaked rags, children's clothing in various sizes, and a detailed floor plan of the school with specific classrooms marked. "They were planning another abduction," Agent Wells said grimly. "Emma might have been the primary target, but they had backup plans." "There's another facility," the older suspect finally admitted after hours of questioning. "Hayes wasn't running everything. He was middle management. The real operation is bigger than you know." Agent Wells leaned forward across the interrogation table. "What kind of facility?" "It's not a school or a warehouse," the man said, his voice shaking with fear of whoever he was about to expose. "It's a summer camp, a real one, with licenses and inspections and parents who pay money to send their kids there. But some of the kids never go home." The revelation hit the investigation team like a physical blow. A legitimate summer camp would provide perfect cover for a trafficking operation. Isolated location, temporary custody of children, parents who expected limited communication during camp sessions, and authority figures that children were trained to trust and obey. "What's the name of the camp?" Agent Wells demanded. "Pine Ridge Adventure Camp," the suspect replied. "It's about 2 hours north of here. The session started last week with 43 kids, but the roster Hayes kept showed 47 names." Clara felt sick as the implications became clear. 4 children had been added to a legitimate camp session, probably taken from other locations and mixed in with children whose parents expected them to be there. If anything happened to those 4 extra children, their disappearance would be hidden among the normal camp activities until it was too late to trace them. Agent Wells was already coordinating a response to Pine Ridge Adventure Camp, while Clara and Rex prepared for what would probably be the most important search of their partnership. If children were being held at the camp against their will, Rex's ability to detect fear and distress could be the key to identifying victims among a group of children who were supposed to be there voluntarily. The drive to Pine Ridge took them through increasingly rural terrain, past farmland and small towns where people still left their doors unlocked, and children rode bikes without helmets. The camp itself was picture perfect: rustic cabins nestled among tall pine trees, a pristine lake with canoes pulled up on the shore, and the kind of natural beauty that made city parents willing to pay premium prices for their children's summer experience. But as their convoy approached the camp's main entrance, Rex's behavior suggested that beneath the idyllic exterior, something was very wrong. "He's detecting multiple distress signatures," Clara reported over the radio, "more than you'd expect from normal homesickness or camp anxiety." The camp director, a woman named Janet Morrison, who looked like she'd stepped out of a wholesome family magazine, greeted the federal agents with the kind of cooperation that immediately raised suspicions. She was too helpful, too understanding, too quick to provide access to records and facilities. "Of course, we want to cooperate with any investigation," Morrison said, her smile never wavering, even as armed federal agents spread throughout her camp. "We have nothing to hide here at Pine Ridge." But Rex was already leading Clara toward the cabin area, his nose tracking scents that suggested children in distress. The dog's behavior was different from his previous searches, less aggressive but more urgent, and as if he understood that they needed to be careful not to traumatize children who might be legitimate campers. The first 3 cabins they searched contained exactly what they expected: children's belongings, camp schedules, letters from home, and all the normal evidence of a summer camp experience. The kids in these cabins were playing games, writing in journals, and exhibiting the normal range of emotions for children away from home for the first time. But in the fourth cabin, Rex's behavior changed dramatically. The dog moved directly to a specific bunk and sat, his body rigid with attention. The bunk belonged to a boy who appeared to be about 7 years old, with blonde hair and the kind of perfect features that Clara now recognized as fitting the trafficking network's preferred profile. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Clara asked gently, kneeling down to the boy's eye level. "I'm supposed to be Jake," the boy replied, but his voice carried uncertainty that suggested he wasn't sure about his own identity. "Supposed to be?" Clara's training in talking to traumatized children kicked in. "What name do you like to use?" The boy looked around nervously, then whispered, "I think my real name is Marcus, but they said I have to be Jake now." Clara's heart broke as she realized what they'd found. This was one of the 4 extra children, a boy who had been taken from somewhere else, given a new identity, and inserted into the camp roster. His confusion about his own name suggested he had been conditioned to accept whatever identity his captors assigned him. Agent Wells approached carefully, her voice gentle and non-threatening. "Marcus, do you remember where you lived before you came to camp?" The boy's face scrunched up with concentration. "There was a place with lots of beds and other kids. A lady with glasses said I was going to have fun at camp, but I don't remember my mommy saying goodbye." The pieces were falling into place with horrifying clarity. Marcus had been taken from one of the network's facilities, given the identity of a legitimate camper, and placed at Pine Ridge where his eventual disappearance would be attributed to a camping accident or runaway incident. Rex was already moving toward another cabin, his alert behavior suggesting they'd found more than one victim. In cabin 6, they discovered 2 girls who exhibited the same confusion about their identities and hazy memories about how they'd arrived at camp. But it was in the camp's administrative building that they found the evidence that revealed the full scope of the operation. Hidden in Janet Morrison's private office, behind a false wall that Rex had detected with his nose, was a sophisticated communication center that connected Pine Ridge to trafficking networks in multiple countries. The computers contained records showing that Pine Ridge had been operating as a trafficking hub for over 3 years, processing children during summer camp sessions when their temporary disappearance would be less likely to trigger immediate investigations. Parents who sent their children to camp expected periods of limited communication, giving the network time to transport victims to their final destinations. They were running 2 camps simultaneously, Dr. Chen explained, as she analyzed the computer files. One legitimate camp for children whose parents had paid tuition, and a shadow camp for children who had been trafficked from other locations. The shadow children were mixed in with legitimate campers to provide cover. The files revealed that children were selected for the shadow camp based on specific criteria: age, appearance, psychological profile, and what the network called placement compatibility. Once at Pine Ridge, shadow children were subjected to what appeared to be normal camp activities, but were actually being prepared for transport to buyers who preferred children who seemed healthy, happy, and well-adjusted. Clara studied photographs that showed legitimate campers participating in normal activities alongside children who'd been trafficked. The images were chilling because they looked so normal. Kids roasting marshmallows around a campfire, swimming in the lake, participating in arts and crafts. Without knowing which children were victims, the photos could have come from any summer camp brochure. But Rex's nose told a different story. As they processed the camp, the dog consistently identified areas and objects associated with fear and distress. His alerts led them to a storage building that contained restraints disguised as camping equipment, a medical facility equipped to sedate children, and communication equipment that had been used to coordinate with buyers around the world. The most damning evidence was found in Morrison's personal quarters, detailed profiles of every child who had passed through the shadow camp program, including their ultimate destinations and the prices paid for them. The files showed that Pine Ridge had processed over 60 children in 3 years, generating millions of dollars in revenue for the trafficking network. Emma's profile was among them, marked Priority Acquisition, Summer Session 2024. The plan had been to abduct her during the camp session and insert her into the shadow program, where her disappearance would be explained as a tragic camping accident. Her body would never be recovered, giving the network time to transport her to a buyer in another country. They had it all planned out, Agent Wells said as she reviewed Emma's file. Fake accident reports, stage search and rescue operations, even fabricated evidence at the lake to support the drowning scenario. Clara felt a chill as she realized how close Emma had come to disappearing completely. If Rex hadn't intervened at the prison visit, if the trafficking attempt at the apartment had succeeded, Emma would have ended up at Pine Ridge, where her fate would have been sealed by people who had turned child endangerment into a business model. The rescue operation at Pine Ridge recovered 4 trafficked children and prevented the abduction of dozens of legitimate campers who had been identified as potential future targets. But it also revealed that the network extended beyond anything they'd previously imagined. Computer files showed connections to similar operations at youth sports camps, church retreats, boarding schools, and even some foster care facilities. The network had infiltrated institutions that parents trusted with their children's safety, turning places that should have provided protection into hunting grounds for predators. As the investigation at Pine Ridge concluded, Clara reflected on how Rex's instincts had unraveled a criminal enterprise that might have continued operating for years. The dog's ability to detect fear and distress had led them from a single interrupted prison visit to a multi-state trafficking network that had destroyed dozens of families. "Officer Jensen," Agent Wells said as they prepared to leave the camp, "I want you to know that what you and Rex have accomplished here goes beyond solving a single case. You've exposed a system that was hiding in plain sight, using our trust in institutions against us." Clara looked at Rex, who was now resting calmly beside their vehicle. The dog seemed to understand that his work at Pine Ridge was finished, but his alert posture suggested he was ready for whatever came next. "He's the real detective here," Clara replied. "I just learned to listen when he talks." As news of the Pine Ridge arrest spread, Clara knew that their work was far from over. The network's computer files contained references to other facilities, other operations, other children who were still missing. But for the first time since this case began, she felt hopeful that they were winning the fight against people who preyed on innocence. The 4 children rescued from Pine Ridge were reunited with families who had given up hope of ever seeing them again. Marcus remembered his real name and his mother's face. The 2 girls began the long process of healing from trauma that no child should ever experience. But perhaps most importantly, dozens of children who had been attending Pine Ridge as legitimate campers went home safely to families who never knew how close they'd come to losing them forever. Emma remained under protective custody, but Agent Wells was optimistic that the network's disruption would eliminate the ongoing threat to her safety. The little girl who had wanted to show her father a crayon drawing was now the key to dismantling an international criminal organization. As Clara drove away from Pine Ridge Adventure Camp, she wondered how many other institutions were hiding similar operations behind facades of legitimacy and trust. The investigation had revealed that predators were sophisticated enough to infiltrate the very systems designed to protect children. Would you ever feel completely safe sending your child to summer camp again, knowing that monsters can hide behind the most innocent-looking activities? 2 weeks after the Pine Ridge operation, Clara Jensen sat in a sterile conference room at FBI headquarters, surrounded by files that represented the most complex case of her career. The trafficking network they'd uncovered had tentacles reaching into institutions across 12 states and 3 countries, but it was the revelation about David Cain that would change everything they thought they knew about the case. Agent Wells spread a series of photographs across the conference table, each showing a man who looked remarkably similar to David Cain visiting different prison facilities over the past year. Same build, same general facial features, same mannerisms, but when subjected to facial recognition analysis, the biometric measurements revealed subtle but significant differences. "We've been working with the wrong assumption from the beginning," Agent Wells announced to the assembled task force. "The man who met with Emma at Greystone Correctional Facility wasn't David Cain." Detective Santos leaned forward, studying the photographs more closely. "What do you mean? We have documentation, visitor logs, even video surveillance of him entering the facility. All of which show someone who was impersonating David Cain," Agent Wells replied. "The real David Cain has been in solitary confinement at a federal facility in Colorado for the past 6 months. He was transferred there after attempting to expose what he thought was corruption in the prison system." Clara felt the pieces of a much larger puzzle beginning to rearrange themselves in her mind. So, when Emma said the hug felt wrong, when she said it wasn't how Daddy hugs, she was absolutely right, Agent Wells confirmed. Children have an instinctive ability to recognize people they love, even when adults can't tell the difference. Emma knew that wasn't her father, even if she couldn't articulate why. The implications were staggering. The trafficking network hadn't just infiltrated prison systems, they had developed the capability to completely replace people within those systems. The man who had tried to hug Emma, the man whose desperate attempt to see his daughter had nearly facilitated her abduction, was an imposter who had been studying David Kane's behavior for months. How is that possible? Detective Santos asked. Prison security, background checks, biometric scans. How do you replace someone in the system without anyone noticing? Dr. Chen pulled up files on her laptop that showed the sophisticated identity manipulation the network had developed. They weren't just trafficking children, she explained. They were also trafficking identities. Look at this. The screen showed a complex organizational chart that revealed how the network operated multiple identity replacement operations simultaneously. Real prisoners were transferred to black site facilities, while operatives took their places in the official prison system. The replacements had access to all the original person's files, family information, and personal history. David Kane was targeted because his family situation made him perfect for their needs, Dr. Chen continued. Single father, estranged from extended family, child in the care of a relative who rarely visited the prison. They could replace him and use his identity to gain access to Emma without anyone immediately noticing the substitution. Clara studied the files, noting the meticulous planning that had gone into David's replacement. The imposter had been trained to mimic David's speech patterns, had been briefed on every detail of his relationship with Emma, and had even been given access to David's medical records to ensure he could pass routine prison health checks. "Where's the real David now?" Clara asked. Agent Wells pulled out another file. "He's been in protective custody since we figured this out. Turns out he's been trying to expose the trafficking network from the inside for over a year. His attempts to alert authorities were what got him transferred to the black site facility." The door to the conference room opened, and Clara was shocked to see a man who looked remarkably similar to the person they had arrested at the prison visit, but whose eyes carried a warmth and desperation that the imposter had never shown. "This is David Kane," Agent Wells said, "the real one." David looked exhausted and older than his years, but when he spoke, his voice carried a love for his daughter that had been completely absent from his imposter. "Is Emma safe? They told me that if I didn't stop asking questions, something would happen to her." Clara found herself comparing this man to the one she'd watched attempt to hug Emma at the prison. The differences were subtle but unmistakable. The way he held his shoulders, the genuine emotion in his voice when he said his daughter's name, the concern that seemed to radiate from every part of his being. "She's safe," Agent Wells assured him. "And she's been asking about you. The real you." David's face crumpled with relief and guilt in equal measure. "I tried to warn people about what was happening at the prison. Inmates were being transferred out and different people were being transferred in. Family visits were being monitored and recorded. I knew something was wrong, but no one would listen." "What made you suspicious?" Detective Santos asked. "A cellmate of mine disappeared overnight," David explained. "Marcus Rivera. One day he was there, worried about his kid who was supposed to start at some summer camp. The next day, there was a different person in his bunk who insisted he had always been Marcus Rivera, but he didn't know Marcus's daughter's name, didn't know about the camp, didn't even know what crime Marcus had been convicted of." Clara felt a chill as she realized they were looking at the scope of the network's identity operations. How many people had been replaced? How many families had been interacting with imposters without knowing it? "We've identified at least 47 cases of identity replacement across 8 different correctional facilities," Agent Wells said. The network was using the prison system as a recruitment and intelligence gathering operation on a massive scale. Dr. Chen pulled up more files showing the psychological profiles the network had developed for their impersonation operations. They specifically targeted inmates with young children, focusing on fathers who had limited contact with their families. The longer the separation, the easier it was to replace them without detection. "But Emma knew," Clara said, thinking about the little girl's reaction at the prison visit. "Somehow she knew that wasn't her father." David wiped tears from his eyes. Emma always was smart about people. Even when she was tiny, she could tell when someone was pretending to be nice. I guess some things you just can't fake. Agent Wells opened another file that contained transcripts of conversations between David and other inmates who had tried to expose the replacement operations. "Your attempts to alert authorities actually helped us understand how the network was operating. Every report you filed, every complaint you made, It all went into our case files. I thought I was failing her, David said quietly. I thought they were going to take my daughter because I couldn't protect her from prison. You saved her, Clara replied. Your resistance to their operation is part of what led us to uncover the network. If you hadn't kept pushing, kept asking questions, we might never have realized what was happening. The revelation about David's replacement forced the task force to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the case. If the network could replace people within the prison system, what other institutions had they infiltrated? How many other families were interacting with imposters? We need to interview Emma again, Agent Wells said. She might be able to help us understand how she knew the difference. Children's instincts could be key to identifying other replacements. Clara thought about Emma's simple statement that the hug felt wrong, her innocent observation that the man didn't smile like her daddy. Children processed information differently than adults, focusing on emotional and sensory cues that adults often overlooked. I'll contact Sarah and arrange the interview, Clara said. But Emma's been through enough trauma. We need to be careful about how we approach this. Agent Wells nodded. We'll use child psychologists and make sure she feels safe. But her insights could help us identify other victims and prevent more families from being targeted. As the meeting concluded, David asked if he could see Emma. The question hung in the air as everyone considered the implications. A father who had been replaced by an imposter, a daughter who had been targeted for trafficking, and a reunion that would need to overcome trauma that neither of them had chosen. That's up to Sarah and Emma, Agent Wells said carefully. She's been through a lot, and she might need time to process the fact that there were two different people who looked like her father. David nodded, understanding but clearly heartbroken. I just want her to know that I never stopped loving her. I never stopped trying to protect her. Clara found herself thinking about the therapeutic value of reuniting families that had been torn apart by the trafficking network. Rex had been trained to help people heal from trauma, and perhaps his presence during a reunion between David and Emma could help both of them begin to process what they'd experienced. Officer Jensen, Agent Wells said as they gathered their files, I want you to know that Rex's intervention at that prison visit didn't just save Emma. It exposed an entire network of identity replacement that we never would have discovered otherwise. Clara looked at Rex, who had been quietly observing the proceedings from his position beside her chair. The dog seemed to understand that they were discussing something important, his alert posture suggesting he was ready for whatever came next. He's always been good at knowing when something's not right, Clara replied. I just wish I'd trusted his instincts sooner. But even as she said it, Clara knew that everything had happened exactly as it needed to. Rex's intervention at the precise moment when Emma was about to be embraced by an imposter had created the chain of events that led to the network's exposure. The following day, Clara and Rex accompanied Agent Wells to the safe house where Emma and Sarah were staying while the investigation continued. The little girl had been asking questions about her daddy, confused by the differences between what she remembered and what she'd experienced at the prison visit. When they explained that there had been two different people, one who was pretending to be her daddy and the real daddy who loved her very much, Emma's response was typically direct. I knew it, she said with the matter-of-fact certainty that only children possess. The pretend daddy didn't smell right. What do you mean? The child psychologist asked gently. Daddy always smells like the soap from when he lived with us, Emma explained. The pretend daddy smelled like different soap, and his hands were wrong. How were his hands wrong? Emma held up her own small hands, examining them carefully. Daddy has a scar on his finger from when he helped me build my dollhouse. The pretend daddy didn't have the scar. Clara marveled at the child's observational skills. Emma had detected differences that trained investigators had missed, using sensory memories that adults often ignored or dismissed. Would you like to see your real daddy? Agent Wells asked carefully. He's been wanting to see you for a very long time. Emma looked thoughtful for a moment, then nodded. But I want Rex to be there too. He knows when people are pretending. The reunion was arranged for the following afternoon at a neutral location where Emma would feel safe and David wouldn't be overwhelmed by the institutional setting that had been the site of so much deception. When David saw Emma for the first time in over a year, his reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Tears of joy mixed with guilt, arms that reached for his daughter with desperate love, and a voice that broke as he said her name. But it was Emma's reaction that confirmed everything they'd suspected about children's ability to recognize authentic relationships. She ran to David without hesitation, launching herself into his arms with complete trust and joy. "Now you smell right," she said as she hugged him tightly. "Now you feel like Daddy." Rex watched the reunion with calm satisfaction, his training telling him that this was what healing looked like. The dog had prevented a tragedy and helped restore a family that had been torn apart by people who saw children as commodities rather than precious individuals. As Clara watched David and Emma reconnect, she reflected on how a simple prison visit had uncovered a network of evil that had been hiding behind institutions designed to protect society's most vulnerable members. The case had revealed that predators could be sophisticated enough to infiltrate prisons, schools, camps, and even families themselves. But it had also revealed that innocence has its own intelligence, that children's instincts can detect deception that fools adults, and that sometimes the most important witnesses are the ones who communicate without words. "Officer Jensen," Sarah said as they prepared to leave the reunion, "I don't know how to thank you and Rex for saving Emma, not just from what they planned to do to her, but from a lifetime of thinking her father didn't love her." Clara looked at Rex, then at Emma, who was still holding tightly to her father's hand. "We all saved each other," she replied. Emma's instincts, Rex's training, David's courage in trying to expose the network. It all came together at exactly the right moment. As they drove away from the reunion, Clara knew that the case would continue for months as authorities worked to identify all the replaced inmates and rescue more victims. But the most important victory had already been won. A little girl was safe with her real father, and a network of predators had been exposed and dismantled. The trafficking operation that had seemed unstoppable had been brought down by the bond between a child and her father, detected by a dog whose instincts had saved more lives than anyone could count. Rex settled into his seat with the contentment of a working dog whose job was complete, but Clara knew that there would be other cases, other children in danger, other families torn apart by people who preyed on innocence and trust. And when those cases came, she and Rex would be ready to listen to the voices that spoke without words and trust the instincts that could detect deception, even when it was hidden behind the most convincing facades. The prison therapy program would be rebuilt under new leadership, with enhanced security protocols designed to prevent the kind of infiltration that had made the trafficking network possible. But Clara knew that the most important lesson from this case wasn't about security systems or background checks. It was about trusting the instincts of those who love unconditionally, children who know their parents' touch, dogs who can smell fear and deception, and families whose bonds can survive even the most sophisticated attempts to destroy them. In the end, love had proven stronger than the most elaborate criminal conspiracy, and innocence had triumphed over those who sought to exploit it. If your own child told you that something felt wrong about a person everyone else trusted, would you believe them? Share this story, hit like if it moved you, subscribe for more incredible true stories, and tell us in the comments, what would make you trust a child's instincts over adult logic?